Thomas McKinnon had never seen a reason to leave the rolling hills of his family ranch. At 52 years old, he knew every fence post, every watering hole, and every patch of grass across the 3,000 acres that had been in his family for 4 generations. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and Thomas made the trip only twice a month for supplies and to check his mail at the post office. The morning started like any other. Thomas woke before dawn, pulled on his worn leather boots, and stepped onto the porch of his modest 2-story farmhouse. The air was crisp with the promise of spring, and he could hear his cattle lowing in the distance. He had 200 head of Angus cattle, and they were his pride and joy. Each animal had a personality, and Thomas knew them all by sight. After checking on the cattle and fixing a section of fence that had come loose during the last storm, Thomas was heading back to the house for lunch when he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A small red car was parked at his front gate, and a woman was standing beside it, waving her arms frantically. Thomas approached slowly, his weathered hands resting on his belt. The woman looked completely out of place against the backdrop of his ranch. She wore a crisp white business suit and high heels that were already caked with mud. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but several strands had come loose and were whipping around her face in the wind. "Excuse me," she called out as Thomas drew near. "Are you the owner of this property?" Thomas nodded, studying her with curious brown eyes. "Thomas McKinnon. This is my land." "You lost?" The woman hurried toward him, her heels wobbling on the uneven ground. "Thank goodness. My name is Sarah Chen, and I desperately need your help. I'm a documentary filmmaker from New York, and I'm working on a project about endangered species. I've been tracking a pack of wolves that wildlife experts believe might be the last of their kind in this region." Thomas frowned. He had heard wolves howling in the distance occasionally, especially during the winter months, but he had never seen them up close. "What's that got to do with me?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him a map with GPS coordinates. "My research team tracked them to somewhere in this area. The wolves have been spotted near a remote valley that I believe is on your property. We need access to film them before they disappear forever." "This could be the most important wildlife discovery of the decade." Thomas looked at the phone screen, then back at Sarah's eager face. He was not comfortable with strangers on his land, especially city folks who did not understand the ways of ranch life. "Lady, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is working ranch land. I can't have people tramping around disturbing my cattle." Sarah's expression grew more desperate. "Please, Mr. McKinnon, these wolves might be gone within weeks. They're searching for new territory because their current habitat is being destroyed by development. If we don't document them now, future generations will never know they existed." Thomas removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. He had lived on this land his entire life, but he had never ventured into the remote northwestern section where Sarah believed the wolves were hiding. That area was rugged terrain, filled with steep ravines and dense forest that made it nearly impossible to reach on horseback. "Even if I wanted to help," Thomas said, "that part of my property isn't accessible by vehicle. It would be a 3-day journey on foot minimum. You'd need camping gear, food, water, and someone who knows the land. It's dangerous territory, especially for someone who—" He gestured at her business attire. Sarah's eyes lit up. "You could guide us. I have a full crew of experienced outdoorsmen, and we have all the necessary equipment. We would pay you well for your time and expertise." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I don't guide people into the wilderness. I raise cattle. That's what I do." But Sarah was persistent. She spent the next hour explaining her project, showing him footage of the wolf pack that her team had captured from a distance, and describing the scientific importance of documenting their behavior. The wolves were a unique subspecies that had adapted to the specific ecosystem of the region, and their loss would be irreplaceable. As Thomas listened, something stirred within him. He had always felt a deep connection to the land and the animals that lived on it. The idea that an entire species might vanish from his property without a trace bothered him more than he cared to admit. "My crew is staying in town," Sarah continued. "We could be ready to leave within 2 days. All we need is someone who knows the terrain." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon where the mountains met the sky. He thought about his father and grandfather, who had worked this land before him. They had always taught him to be a steward of the environment, to protect and preserve what had been entrusted to him. 3 days, he said finally. "That's not enough time. If these wolves are where you think they are, it would take us 4 days minimum to reach them, and another 4 to get back. And that's assuming good weather." Sarah nodded eagerly. "We're prepared for a week-long expedition. We have satellite communication equipment in case of emergencies." Thomas sighed deeply. He had never been away from his ranch for more than 2 days at a time. The thought of leaving his cattle and his daily routines for over a week made him uncomfortable. But something about Sarah's passion for her work reminded him of his own dedication to his land. "I'd need to arrange for my neighbor to check on the cattle," Thomas said slowly, "and I'd want to see your equipment and meet your crew before I agree to anything." Sarah practically bounced with excitement. "Of course. We can bring everything here tomorrow for your inspection. You won't regret this, Mr. McKinnon. This could change everything we know about wolf behavior in this region." After Sarah left, Thomas spent the evening on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He called his neighbor, Jake Morrison, who agreed to check on the cattle while Thomas was away. Jake thought Thomas had lost his mind when he explained the situation. "You're going to guide some city folks into the backcountry?" Jake laughed. "Thomas, you haven't been more than 50 miles from this ranch in 20 years. Thomas knew Jake was right. The farthest he had traveled in recent memory was to the county fair, and that was only 30 miles away. The thought of venturing into the remote wilderness of his own property felt like planning a trip to another planet. That night, Thomas lay in bed thinking about the wolves Sarah had described. He had heard their howls echoing across the mountains on quiet winter nights, but he had never imagined they might be the last of their kind. The idea that something so wild and free could disappear forever from his land troubled him deeply. The next morning, Sarah returned with her crew. There were 4 people in addition to herself: a cameraman named Marcus, who looked like he had spent his life outdoors, a sound technician named Elena, who spoke with a slight accent, a wildlife biologist named Dr. James Wright, and a guide named Ray, who had experience in mountain terrain. Thomas was impressed by their equipment. They had lightweight camping gear designed for harsh conditions, professional-grade cameras that could function in extreme weather, and communication devices that could reach emergency services from anywhere in the mountains. Sarah had clearly prepared for every possible scenario. Dr. Wright showed Thomas detailed maps of wolf migration patterns and explained the significance of documenting this particular pack. "These wolves have developed unique hunting strategies adapted to this specific terrain," he explained. "Their behavior could provide crucial insights into wolf evolution and adaptation." Thomas found himself drawn into the conversation. Despite his simple lifestyle, he had always been interested in the wildlife that shared his land. He had observed countless animals over the years, from deer and elk to eagles and bears, but he had never had the opportunity to learn about them from a scientific perspective. Ray, the mountain guide, seemed to understand Thomas's reservations. "I know this is a big step for you," he said quietly, "but your knowledge of this land could make the difference between success and failure for this project." As the day progressed, Thomas found himself warming to the idea of the expedition. Sarah's crew was professional and respectful, and they clearly understood the challenges they would face. More importantly, they seemed to genuinely care about protecting the wolves and their habitat. That evening, after Sarah and her team had returned to town, Thomas sat on his porch and made his decision. He would guide them into the wilderness. For the first time in his life, he would venture beyond the familiar boundaries of his daily existence. The next morning, Thomas packed his gear with the same methodical care he used for every task on the ranch. He chose his most reliable hiking boots, his warmest jacket, and his father's compass, which had never failed him in all his years of working the land. He loaded his pickup truck with supplies and drove to town to meet Sarah's team. As Thomas parked in front of the small motel where the crew was staying, he felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety unlike anything he had experienced before. Sarah emerged from her room, carrying a large backpack, her business suit replaced by practical hiking clothes. She looked different in outdoor gear, more at ease and determined. "Ready for an adventure?" she asked with a smile. Thomas nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was getting himself into. "Let's go find your wolves." The journey began at dawn the following day. Thomas led the group through a series of narrow trails that wound through thick forest and across rocky streams. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed higher into the mountains, but Thomas navigated with the confidence of someone who had spent his life reading the land. By midday, they had left all traces of civilization behind. The only sounds were their footsteps on the forest floor and the distant calls of birds. Thomas found himself enjoying the experience more than he had expected. Sarah and her team moved quietly and respectfully through the wilderness, and their enthusiasm for the project was contagious. As they set up camp that first night, Thomas realized that he was farther from his ranch than he had been in decades. The familiar routines of his daily life seemed like distant memories. For the first time in years, he was truly present in the moment, focused entirely on the challenges and discoveries of each step of the journey. Sarah sat by the campfire that evening, reviewing footage from her previous wolf encounters. "Thank you for doing this," she said to Thomas. "I know it's not easy to leave everything behind." Thomas poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks dance up into the star-filled sky. "Maybe it's time I saw more of my own land," he admitted. "I've spent so many years taking care of the parts I know, I forgot there was so much more to discover." As he settled into his sleeping bag that night, Thomas could hear wolves howling somewhere in the distance. The sound was clearer and more haunting than he had ever heard it from his ranch house. Tomorrow, they would venture deeper into the wilderness, and Thomas would discover just how much of his own world he had yet to explore. The second day of their journey brought challenges that Thomas had not anticipated. The weather turned cold and rainy, making the mountain trails slippery and dangerous. Sarah's team struggled with the conditions, and their expensive equipment became a burden as they navigated steep slopes covered in wet leaves and loose rocks. Thomas found himself taking on responsibilities he had never expected. When Marcus slipped and twisted his ankle while carrying heavy camera equipment, Thomas helped redistribute the gear among the team members. When Elena's specialized microphone got soaked in a sudden downpour, Thomas improvised a waterproof covering using materials from his own pack. "You're full of surprises," Sarah said as she watched Thomas wrap the delicate equipment in plastic and canvas. "Where did you learn to do that?" Thomas shrugged, securing the makeshift protection with rope. "When you live 40 miles from the nearest store, you learn to fix things with whatever you have on hand." The group made slower progress than planned, and by evening they were still a full day's hike from where Dr. Wright believed the wolves might be denning. They set up camp in a small clearing beside a rushing stream, the sound of water providing a constant backdrop to their conversations. Ray, the experienced mountain guide, was impressed by Thomas's knowledge of the terrain. "I've been leading expeditions for 15 years, he told Sarah quietly. "But this man knows every stone and tree like they're part of his own body." Thomas overheard the comment and felt a strange sense of pride. He had never thought of his familiarity with the land as anything special, but seeing it through the eyes of these outsiders made him realize how deep his connection to this place truly was. That night, as the team huddled around a small campfire, Dr. Wright shared more details about the wolf pack they were seeking. Based on our tracking data, this pack consists of 7 individuals, he explained. There's an alpha pair that's been together for at least 4 years, 3 younger adults, and 2 pups born last spring. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. What makes this pack so unique? Dr. Wright pulled out a notebook filled with observations and sketches. They've adapted their hunting patterns to this specific terrain in ways we've never documented before. Instead of pursuing large prey across open ground, they've learned to coordinate ambush attacks in the narrow ravines and dense forest areas. Thomas listened carefully to every word. He had seen evidence of wolf kills over the years, but had never understood the sophisticated strategies behind them. How do you know all this if you've never seen them up close? He asked. Remote cameras and GPS tracking, Dr. Wright replied. We've been following this pack for 8 months, but they're incredibly elusive. Getting close enough for detailed behavioral documentation has been impossible until now. As the fire died down, Thomas lay in his sleeping bag thinking about the wolves. He imagined them moving through the darkness just beyond their camp, silent and intelligent, perfectly adapted to this harsh environment. The thought both thrilled and humbled him. The third day brought them into terrain that Thomas had never explored, even in his 52 years on the ranch. The forest grew thicker and more ancient, with massive pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of needles that muffled their footsteps. Sarah walked beside Thomas for most of the morning, asking questions about the various plants and animals they encountered. Her curiosity was endless, and Thomas found himself sharing knowledge he had accumulated over decades of observation. That's mountain laurel, he said, pointing to a flowering shrub. The leaves are poisonous to livestock, so I always watch for it in the lower pastures. And those tracks there belong to a black bear, probably passed through here last night. Sarah knelt to examine the tracks, taking careful photographs. How can you tell when they were made? Thomas crouched beside her, pointing to the edges of the paw prints. See how the dirt is still soft here. And there's no debris blown into the depression? Fresh tracks have clean edges? These are maybe 6 hours old. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Thomas began to feel a sense of discovery that he had not experienced since childhood. Every turn in the trail revealed new vistas, and he found himself seeing his own land with fresh eyes. The familiar boundaries of his daily life seemed incredibly small compared to the vast wilderness they were traveling through. Marcus, despite his injured ankle, continued to film their journey. This footage is incredible, he told Sarah during a rest stop. The landscape is more dramatic than anything I've seen in Colorado or Montana, Elena agreed as she adjusted her recording equipment. The acoustic environment is perfect for capturing natural sounds. These mountains create amazing echoes and reverberations. By afternoon, they had reached a high ridge that offered spectacular views of the surrounding valleys. Thomas had never seen his property from this perspective, and the sight took his breath away. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, broken by rivers and forests that seemed to go on forever. Your ranch is bigger than I realized, Sarah said, standing beside him at the edge of the ridge. Thomas nodded, still absorbing the scale of what he was seeing. My great-grandfather claimed all the land he could see from this spot. I never understood what that meant until now. Dr. Wright was busy studying his maps and GPS coordinates. According to our data, the wolf den should be in a valley about 2 miles north of here. The terrain looks challenging, but we should be able to reach it by tomorrow morning. That evening, as they prepared camp on the ridge, Thomas realized how much he had changed in just 3 days. The anxious rancher who had worried about leaving his cattle now felt energized by the challenges of the wilderness. He found himself looking forward to each new discovery rather than counting the days until he could return home. Sarah noticed the change in him as they shared dinner around the campfire. "You seem different than when we started," she observed. "More comfortable with all this." Thomas considered her words as he ate the simple meal of dried fruits and trail mix. "I've spent my whole life taking care of one small part of this land. I forgot that it extends far beyond what I can see from my back porch." Ray nodded approvingly. "The mountains have a way of changing people. You start to see yourself as part of something bigger." That night, Thomas lay awake listening to the sounds of the wilderness around them. Owls called from the forest below, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the haunting howl of wolves. The sound was closer than ever before, and he knew they were near their destination. The fourth day dawned clear and cold. Thomas woke before the others and stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The sight was so beautiful it made his chest tight with emotion. He had lived his entire life surrounded by this magnificence, but he had never taken the time to truly see it. Sarah joined him as he prepared coffee over the camp stove. "Penny for your thoughts?" Thomas smiled, a rare expression for him. "I was thinking about my father. He used to tell stories about the old days when this whole region was wild. I always thought those times were gone forever." "Maybe they're not as gone as you thought," Sarah suggested. The descent into the valley where Dr. Wright believed they would find the wolves was treacherous. The trail was little more than a deer path that wound between massive boulders and through thick stands of aspen trees. Thomas led the way, choosing each step carefully and helping the others navigate the most difficult sections. Marcus had to leave most of his heavy equipment behind, carrying only the most essential cameras. Elena struggled with her sound recording gear, but refused Thomas's offers to help carry it. "This is the most important work I've ever done," she insisted. "I want to handle it myself." As they descended deeper into the valley, signs of wolf activity became more apparent. Thomas pointed out scratch marks on trees, worn paths through the underbrush, and areas where the ground had been disturbed by digging. Dr. Wright was nearly vibrating with excitement. "These territorial markings are exactly what we expected to find. The pack has definitely established this valley as their primary hunting ground." Around midday, they reached a dense grove of evergreen trees that formed a natural shelter. Dr. Wright checked his GPS coordinates and nodded with satisfaction. "This is it. The den should be within a few hundred yards of here." Sarah and her team began unpacking their equipment with practiced efficiency. Thomas watched in fascination as they set up cameras and microphones designed to capture wildlife behavior without disturbing the animals. The technology was far more sophisticated than anything he had imagined. "Now we wait," Sarah explained. "Wolves are most active during dawn and dusk. If we're quiet and patient, we should see them when they leave the den to hunt." Thomas had spent his life waiting for the right moments to move cattle, fix fences, or harvest crops. But this kind of waiting was different. They sat in complete silence for hours, barely moving, attuned to every sound and movement in the forest around them. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself entering a state of awareness he had never experienced before. Every sense seemed heightened. He could distinguish between the sounds made by different birds, feel the subtle changes in air pressure that indicated shifting weather, and detect the faint scents that marked the presence of various animals. Just as the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees, Thomas heard a sound that made his heart race. It was barely audible, a soft rustling in the underbrush about 50 yards away. Sarah heard it too. She signaled to her team, and they froze in complete stillness. Marcus slowly turned his camera toward the sound, while Elena adjusted her microphone to capture even the faintest noises. Thomas held his breath as a magnificent gray wolf stepped into a small clearing between the trees. The animal was larger than he had expected, with thick fur and intelligent yellow eyes that seemed to survey the entire area before taking another step. The wolf was followed by another, slightly smaller but equally impressive. Dr. Wright had been right about the alpha pair. These were clearly the leaders of the pack, confident and alert as they emerged from their hidden den. Sarah's camera clicked softly as she captured image after image. The wolves' heads turned at the sound, but they showed no fear or aggression. They seemed to sense that the humans posed no immediate threat. Over the next hour, Thomas watched in amazement as the entire pack emerged from hiding. The three younger adults moved with the same fluid grace as their leaders, while the two pups tumbled and played in the clearing, supervised by the watchful eyes of their parents. Dr. Wright whispered explanations as they observed the wolves' behavior. See how the alpha male positions himself between the pups and any potential danger, and watch the female's ears. She's constantly listening for threats from all directions. Thomas was mesmerized by the intelligence and coordination displayed by the pack. These were not the savage beasts of legend, but sophisticated family groups with complex social structures and deep emotional bonds. As darkness fell, the wolves began to move toward the edge of the clearing. Thomas knew they were preparing to hunt, and he felt privileged to witness this ancient ritual. The alpha male lifted his head and released a long, haunting howl that echoed through the valley. The sound was answered by howls from the other pack members, creating a chorus that seemed to celebrate the wildness of this remote place. When the last wolf disappeared into the forest, Sarah and her team sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, Dr. Wright spoke in a whisper. "That was extraordinary. I've never seen wolves behave so naturally around humans." Sarah turned to Thomas with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for making this possible. Without your knowledge of this land, we never would have found them." Thomas felt a profound sense of accomplishment, unlike anything he had experienced in his years of ranch work. He had helped preserve something wild and beautiful that might otherwise have been lost forever. That night, as they camped in the valley near the wolf den, Thomas lay awake thinking about his life. In 4 days, he had traveled farther from home than he had in decades, but he felt more connected to his land than ever before. The wolves had shown him that The return journey began with an unexpected challenge. During their second night near the wolf den, a severe storm moved through the mountains, bringing heavy rain and dangerous winds. Thomas woke to the sound of trees crashing in the forest around their campsite. "We need to move," he told Sarah's team urgently. "Flash floods are common in these valleys during heavy rain." Within minutes, Thomas had organized the group to pack their essential gear and relocate to higher ground. His quick thinking and knowledge of the terrain likely saved their lives, as the stream beside their original campsite rose 4 feet within an hour, washing away everything they had left behind. Huddled under a rock overhang as the storm raged, Sarah looked at Thomas with newfound respect. "How did you know the flood was coming?" Thomas listened to the sound of rain on stone and wind through the trees. "The water changes pitch when the stream starts to rise. My grandfather taught me to listen for it when I was 8 years old." Dr. Wright shook his head in amazement. "That kind of knowledge can't be learned from books." The storm delayed their departure by a full day, but it also provided an unexpected opportunity. As they waited for conditions to improve, Thomas shared stories about the history of his family's ranch. He told them about his great-grandfather's arrival in the territory, the challenges of establishing the ranch, and the gradual changes he had witnessed in the local wildlife over the decades. Sarah recorded their conversations, realizing that Thomas's oral history was as valuable as the wolf footage they had captured. "Your family's story is part of the land story," she told him. People need to hear about the connection between ranching families and wildlife conservation. When the weather finally cleared, they began the difficult journey back through terrain that had been transformed by the storm. New streams had appeared overnight, fallen trees blocked familiar trails, and the wet conditions made every step treacherous. Thomas adapted to each obstacle with the same patient problem-solving approach he used for ranch work. When a rock slide blocked their planned route, he found an alternative path. When Elena's equipment was damaged by falling debris, he helped her repair it using wire and tape from his emergency kit. Marcus, whose ankle had healed during their extended stay, was able to carry his full camera equipment again. He documented Thomas's leadership throughout their journey, capturing images that showed a man completely at ease in conditions that would have defeated most people. "You should see yourself through my camera lens," Marcus told Thomas during a rest stop. "You're not the same person who met us at your ranch gate a week ago." Thomas considered this as they continued their trek through the transformed landscape. He knew Marcus was right. Something fundamental had shifted within him during their time in the wilderness. The boundaries of his world had expanded beyond anything he had previously imagined. On their third day of the return journey, they encountered another group of hikers who had become lost in the storm. The family of 4 from Denver had been hiking for 2 days without proper equipment, and they were exhausted and frightened. Without hesitation, Thomas took charge of the situation. He shared food and water from their limited supplies, treated minor injuries with his first aid kit, and guided the lost hikers back to the main trail system. Sarah watched him interact with the family with the same gentle competence he had shown throughout their expedition. "Thank you so much," the father said as Thomas pointed them toward the correct trail. "We had no idea how dangerous these mountains could be." Thomas nodded seriously. The wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes, but it rewards respect and preparation. As the Denver family headed safely toward civilization, Elena commented on Thomas's actions. "You could have just given them directions and continued on our way." Thomas looked surprised by her observation. "When someone needs help in the mountains, you help them. That's not a choice, it's a responsibility." Sarah realized that this attitude reflected Thomas's fundamental character. He approached every challenge with the same sense of duty and care, whether he was protecting lost hikers, repairing damaged equipment, or preserving wolf habitat. The final day of their journey brought them back to familiar territory near Thomas's ranch. As they descended from the high country into the rolling hills where his cattle grazed, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He was eager to return to his normal routines, but he was also reluctant to end this transformative experience. Sarah's team was quiet as they approached Thomas's pickup truck, which seemed like an artifact from another world after their week in the wilderness. They loaded their gear with the efficient movements of people who had learned to work together under challenging conditions. "What happens now?" Thomas asked Sarah as she secured her equipment in the vehicle. Sarah smiled, but her expression was tinged with the same sadness Thomas was feeling. "Now I go back to New York and edit the footage into a documentary. Dr. Wright will write his research papers and hopefully will raise awareness about the importance of protecting wolf habitat." Thomas nodded, understanding the larger purpose of their mission. "And the wolves? They'll stay here, on your land, as long as they have a safe place to live," Sarah replied. "That's up to you now." As they drove back to town, Thomas thought about the implications of Sarah's words. He had always considered himself a steward of his land, but now he understood that his responsibilities extended far beyond his cattle operation. The wolves, the forest, the entire ecosystem depended on decisions he had never consciously made before. That evening, after Sarah's team had returned to their motel, Thomas sat on his familiar porch and tried to process everything that had happened. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, but the sound of their lowing was joined by the memory of wolf howls echoing through mountain valleys. Jake Morrison stopped by to check on Thomas and report on the cattle. "Everything went fine while you were gone," Jake said, settling into the chair beside Thomas. "But I have to say, you look different. That trip really changed you, didn't it?" Thomas considered his neighbor's observation. "I discovered that my land is bigger than I thought, and my responsibilities are bigger too." Jake laughed, assuming Thomas was joking. But Thomas was entirely serious. He had spent his entire adult life focused on maximizing the productivity of his ranch. But now he understood that true stewardship required balancing human needs with the requirements of the wild creatures that shared his property. The next morning, Thomas began making changes to his ranch operation. He decided to establish conservation easements on the remote northwestern section of his property, ensuring that the wolf habitat would be protected in perpetuity. He also began researching sustainable ranching practices that would minimize his impact on the local ecosystem. Sarah called him regularly over the following weeks, sharing updates on her documentary progress and seeking his advice on technical details. Their conversations gradually evolved from business discussions to genuine friendship. Thomas found himself looking forward to their talks, which always left him feeling more connected to the larger world beyond his ranch. 3 months after their expedition, Sarah returned to screen the completed documentary for Thomas. She had worked with a local theater in the nearby town to arrange a special showing for ranchers and community members. Thomas was amazed by what Sarah had created. The documentary told the story of the wolf pack, but it also captured his own journey from isolation to environmental awareness. Marcus's footage showed Thomas in moments of quiet leadership and gentle competence that he had never seen in himself. The community response to the documentary was overwhelmingly positive. Other ranchers approached Thomas after the screening to discuss conservation practices and wildlife protection. Several expressed interest in exploring their own properties for endangered species habitat. Dr. Wright attended the screening and announced that his research on the wolf pack had been accepted for publication in a prestigious wildlife journal. Thomas's observations were crucial to our understanding of their behavior, he told the audience. He has a naturalist's eye that comes from a lifetime of careful attention to the land. After the screening, Sarah and Thomas walked through his ranch under a star-filled sky. The familiar landscape looked different to Thomas now, enriched by his understanding of its hidden complexity and ecological importance. "I have a confession," Sarah said as they reached the gate where she had first asked for his help. "When I drove up to your ranch that day, I was desperate. We had been searching for weeks without finding the wolves, and my funding was about to run out." Thomas smiled. "I could tell you were desperate. That's probably the only reason I agreed to help." Sarah laughed. "But I never expected to find someone like you. You taught me as much as I taught you during our time in the mountains." Thomas considered her words. It was true that he had changed during their expedition, but he was only beginning to understand how profoundly. The isolated rancher who had never left his pastures had discovered a world of infinite complexity and beauty that existed right under his nose. 6 months later, Thomas received word that Sarah's documentary had won several national awards for environmental filmmaking. She called to share the news and to tell him that the film was being distributed to schools and nature centers across the country. "Your story is inspiring other people to explore their own relationships with the land," she told him. "That was the real impact I hoped we could achieve." Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that their work was making a difference beyond his own property. He had begun leading occasional hiking groups into the mountains, sharing his knowledge of local wildlife and conservation practices. The shy rancher who had once avoided strangers now found purpose in educating others about the importance of protecting wild spaces. The wolf pack continued to thrive in their remote valley. Thomas monitored their activities from a respectful distance. ensuring that their habitat remained undisturbed while documenting their behavior for Dr. Wright's ongoing research. On quiet evenings, Thomas often climbed to the ridge where he had first seen the full extent of his property. The view never failed to fill him with wonder and humility. He understood now that his role as a rancher was just one small part of a much larger story about the relationship between humans and the natural world. The cattle still grazed in his familiar pastures. But Thomas's perspective on his responsibilities had expanded to encompass everything from soil health to wildlife corridors. He had learned that true stewardship required constant attention to the interconnected systems that made life possible on the land. 1 year after their expedition, Sarah visited the ranch again to film a follow-up documentary about conservation ranching practices. As they hiked through the same trails they had traveled together, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed. "Do you ever regret leaving your comfortable routines?" Sarah asked as they paused at a scenic overlook. Thomas thought about her question while watching an eagle circle overhead. "I regret waiting so long to discover what was always here, but I'm grateful you forced me to see beyond my fence lines." Sarah nodded, understanding the profound transformation that had taken place. The city woman who had desperately needed the rancher's help had given him something far more valuable in return: a new understanding of his place in the world and his responsibility to protect it for future generations. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Thomas McKinnon stood in the wilderness he had helped preserve and felt truly at home for the first time in his life. He had learned that the wilds had always been part of him, waiting patiently for him to recognize their call and answer with the full measure of his commitment and care. The rancher, who had never left his pastures, had discovered that the greatest journeys happen not when we travel to distant places, but when we finally see the infinite richness and responsibility of the ground beneath our feet.